Now for today's program. Dina Kraft is a journalist based in Tel Aviv, where she is the opinion editor at Haaretz English and co-host of Groundwork, a podcast about Israelis and Palestinians working for change. Previously, Dina was a foreign correspondent for the Associated Press, the Christian Science Monitor, and JTA. Dina has reported from over a dozen countries and was the recipient of a Nieman Fellowship at Harvard University and an Achbrook Fellowship at the Dart Center for Journalism and Trauma at Columbia University. Her work has been published in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and Moment Magazine, among others. She was a winner of the 2020 B'nai B'rith World Center Jerusalem Award for Journalism, recognizing excellence in diaspora reportage. Dina is the co-author of the New York Times best-selling book, My Friend Anne Frank, the inspiring and heartbreaking true story of best friends torn apart and reunited against all odds. Laurel Leff is professor of journalism and associate director of Jewish studies at Northeastern University in Boston. Her latest book, Well Worth Saving, American University's Life and Death Decisions on Refugees from Nazi Europe, was a finalist for a 2020 National Jewish Book Award. Her previous book, Buried by the Times, The Holocaust and America's Most Important Newspaper, was chosen as the best media history book of 2005 by the American Journalism Historians Association and best history book of 2005 by Forward Reviews. She has published several monographs on the response of American elites to pleas to rescue European Jews during the 1930s and 40s, most recently an examination of Edward R. Murrow and the Holocaust in American journalism. Laurel was formerly a reporter for the Wall Street Journal and the Miami Herald, and an editor with the American Lawyer Media Inc. and the Hartford Courant. Please welcome Dina Kraft and Laurel Leff.
Hello, everybody. I'm really gratified to be here. It's an amazing book, and that's not just because it's by my amazing friend, Dina. It also, I think for those of us who read a lot about the Holocaust, I imagine many of you fall into that category. Every time there's a new book, you sort of wonder, am I really going to discover anything? Am I going to understand anything differently? And I think the answer unquestionably for My Friend Anne Frank is yes, you do. And I think that's largely because in reading the book, you're really transported to the events, sometimes in a way that it's a little hard to take. And I'm going to give just one example, and maybe some of you who have already read the book would share this, but there's a moment when the family who've been living in Amsterdam in their nice apartment, and they are transported to this horrible, although not as horrible as the one to come, concentration camp or transit camp at Westerbork. And it's only a 3-hour train ride, so it's not as if they've already endured this, days long. And they are dressed in the clothes that they wore, and they have the sort of the memories of their breakfast. And they arrive in this camp, and Hannah has to make up her bed with the terrible, thin mattress. And then she gets into the bed, and there are fleas. And even though it is not the worst of the horrors to come, it just, is the moment where you think, I can so feel what she's feeling. And that I had actually at that point had to stop. And that doesn't usually happen with me, because there are so many of these books that I've read and experiences I've tried to digest. But that was really a moment where at least at that point, I couldn't go on. But most of it, you can plunge through it. And I think that's because Hannah, like Primo Levi, and I don't raise that comparison lightly, I know all of what that means, is such a sure-footed narrator that you can kind of be there with her. And that's what I think you're doing largely in this book. So what I want to talk about today with Dina is sort of how she did that, how she managed to convey that immediacy that we feel in reading My Friend Anne Frank. And I want to start actually with really much more mundane things, which is there may be points along the way I'm going to mispronounce names. Correct me, Dina, don't feel embarrassed about doing that. And I sort of wanted to start with a biggie, which is, I think we usually refer to Anne Frank, but there's a suggestion in the book that the proper way to say it is Anna, like Anna and Sana and Hannah. And I just want to know, should we be saying Anna Frank?
Well, I have to say that I don't mean to sound pretentious, but I say Anna now almost all the time when I talk about Anna Frank, because that's when I sat for months with Hannah. That's how she referred to her best friend, was Anna, because that was how everyone knew her.
Okay, good. I wanted to, and I will do my best to refer to her as Anna Frank, but that's not really where I wanted to start. I just wanted to clear that up. One of the, to me, remarkable things about the book is that you really, it's so conversational. You really feel as if Hannah is talking to you. And of course, she, constructs a narrative better and speaks better than anyone does in actual conversation. But I was wondering how you were able to manage that. What your method was, what your technique was, so that we felt as if, or certainly I felt as if in reading the book, that I was sitting there having Hannah talk with me about these events.
That's a really good question. I think I spent so many months sitting with Hannah and talking with her. I mean, partially it was during COVID, so it was through a screen sometimes, through the screen, and sometimes it was in person. But I think sort of getting a sense of the cadence of how she spoke and what she talked about and what she emphasized. And I think because there were a lot of things that she would just come back to and repeat. I think I heard recently that in adolescence, we remember much more sort of what happened to us in that sort of adolescence time period between like 12, 15, 16, than we do of almost any other period of our lives. That's why, for example, if you learned how to juggle when you were 12 or 13, you might still know how to juggle, or you might still play that same piano piece that you learned in middle school. So I think there was a combination of these very formative memories that she had, because that was just the time and she was sort of coming of age. And this is when your memory sort of imprints more, but also because trauma imprints more as well, And I also sort of was looking at my own daughter, who was, she just turned 16 this week, but she was 14. She was 14 going on 15 when I was writing, and then 15. And so I was kind of spying on her a little bit and her friends in a way, and sort of watching them and how they conversed and how they spoke, and thinking back to my own relationships at those ages as well, and kind of bringing that, sort of channeling that. Yeah.
So I want to even get a little bit more into the nitty gritty. So, I mean, you did tons of interviews, right? You spent lots and lots of time, but then you also looked at other interviews that she had done over the years. You looked at secondary sources that Hannah probably wasn't familiar with. When you sat down to sort of reconstruct and tell the story, did you use all of that and then kind of rewrite what she had told you and then go back to her and say, this is the way I'm going to present it?
It was a little bit of pastiche, I was I felt like a little bird going into the world and getting little pieces and bits of the story. There was a story that she told me. And as you know, from talking to Holocaust survivors and other survivors of trauma, sometimes their stories can, they sort of have a script and they stick to it. So the challenge is to sort of draw deeper information out from them. That was hard. She was 93 years old. She wasn't in great health when we were speaking. I was cognizant of not, completely exhausting her. But I did use the tools that I learned as a narrative journalist, which is to ask lots and lots of details, and it was interesting, and I told her, this is going to be annoying. I'm going to sit down, I'm going to ask you a lot of questions, and you're going to think they're really stupid, like, what color was your couch? And she was like, I don't remember what color my couch was. She's like, oh my gosh, it was blue. It was velvet, and these are like these really telling details that were really helpful. And so she was remembering, amazingly so, things that were like way, that sort of some things that she thought she'd forgotten. But yes, and there was sort of prodding her and pushing her. She comes from a very like Yeke German background, which is a place where they didn't really have a lot of access to their emotions. So I was always pushing and prodding, but like, how did it feel? Not good. Okay, give me some more, and I was like trying to, get it out of her. And sometimes I'd be successful and sometimes I'd be less successful. And I would have to sort of imagine, okay, she said she was scared. Let me sort of imagine what does scared feel like. I knew she was shivering. I knew she was shivering, not just from the cold, but from fear, trying to get the sort of visceral things. But yes, I was very, I would go out into, like I said, sort of little bird trying to get information. What I found really helpful were first person testimonies, especially ones that came in 45 and in the early 40s, so in the late 1940s. I found those helpful. as well as other memoir. She's not the only friend of Anne Frank's who's written a memoir. Jacqueline Van Morrison, who was her other best friend, has also wrote, I think, 2 memoirs about her time with Anne, and other friends as well. So I was sort of cobbling through that. I was bringing her things. I mean, she was so delighted to see one of her friends' books that she hadn't even known had come out, a friend who lives in South America. And so she would read it and we'd go over and I would say, do you remember what she said? And sometimes she would, and sometimes she wouldn't. But it was really very helpful to have also that she's been interviewed over the years. So she always said to me, oh, Dina, I wish we had done this 20 years ago, but luckily 20 years ago, she did do an interview with the USC Shoah Foundation, the Spielberg Foundation, which I give a shout out to, because not only Hannah's interview from that collection was helpful to me, but also other people in her milieu from Amsterdam would also give an interview as I looked through their interviews. In one case, the story of the good, one of her other best friends was Sana Letterman. Her older sister, Barbara, gave a tremendous interview also about 25 years ago with incredible detail about her own going underground and her own final minutes with her family the very same morning that Hannah's family was deported. And so I brought this back to Hannah and she was amazed to hear this. So, we were working together.
Well enough to, like, when you find, you had a completed manuscript, was she able to go over and sign off on it? No,
she was able to read sections before she died, but not the entire manuscript, unfortunately, no. So
I wanted to come back now to the details, because I think, there's so much that is remarkable about this book, but that to me is the most remarkable thing. And I think the example of the blue velvet couch, which I remembered, right, is a really great example. But it's throughout the book. I mean, the details are astonishing. And I think what I'd like to do now is just ask you to read a little bit from the book that will sort of show the kind of level of detail. And then we can go back to it and maybe talk about a few other examples and how you were able to come up with those details.
Sure. Hold on one second. Okay. So just as a quick preface, this is just after liberation. This is just after liberation, and she is in a house that she's sort of commandeered of sorts in the village, a very tiny village in East Germany. She says, "We had to get clean. That I knew, trying to think of what my mother would have told us to do next. I perched Gabi on a chair in the bathroom and peeled off our soiled, lice-infested clothes. I sponged her and then myself with the cold water that ran from the tap. I was shivering as I washed my hair, but still I barely felt the cold. It was exhilarating to wash away weeks of filth and sweat, to remember what being clean felt like again. I was astonished to see Gabi's eyes shine out from her soft, freshly washed face. I found a dress hanging in a closet, made of red wool with black geometric shapes. It was my size. I presumed it belonged to a girl who lived in the house. It was nothing special, just a regular dress, but it was a dress without lice. I stepped into it slowly and for a moment let myself luxuriate in the newness of such a sensation. No itching, no stickiness, no stench. Now that both of us were clean and in clean clothes, I pulled down the white eiderdown quilt on the bed in the room Gabi and I were going to share. I caressed the white sheets, feeling the softness of the cotton, inhaling their freshly washed smell. Their unblemished whiteness felt almost blinding to my eyes. My dream from the barracks of Bergen-Belsen was coming true, a clean, soft bed. Our emaciated bodies sank into the mattress. I pulled the quilt close over the two of us and snuggled into it, totally elated. Gabi giggled. I was also struck that we were alone in our own private, quiet room, none of the racket from the crowded, ever-noisy barracks. I looked out from the bed and around the room, noticing that the light green walls were actually wallpaper. There was a repeating pattern of a shape on it. It suddenly took form before my eyes, swastikas. I could hardly believe it. The bedroom we were sleeping in on our first night of freedom was covered in swastika wallpaper.
So did she volunteer the swastika wallpaper?
Oh yeah, she did.
Yeah,
it was one of her seminal memories. I mean, I couldn't understand what she was saying. I was like, wait, say that again. Say that again. I just really couldn't understand it. It didn't make any sense to me. How could somebody have swastika wallpaper? It turned out that the house belonged to the mayor of this little village, and he was an ardent Nazi, which is part of why he had fled the village, because he was worried he was going to get caught by the liberating Russian troops. But No, that was, and those sheets and the eiderdown quilt. I mean, everybody, Hannah told me that everybody in the camp sort of fixated on different things, like what they were looking forward to after liberation. There was a lot of talk about food. There was a lot of talk of women, a lot of chatter in the barracks. The women would swap recipes and talk about fancy dinner parties and talk about how to make this cake and this strudel. And she didn't really have much interest in that. But all she really wanted to eat was toast with jam and butter and a hard-boiled egg. And she just wanted to be clean. She wanted to have a clean bed after those 2 years of not sleeping on a bed. As you mentioned, her first mattress, of course, was infested with fleas, and it was, thin and just was filled with straw. Like, she just missed those basic creature comforts.
And so I think those, falls into what you were talking about before, that remembering sort of the trauma. I think there's so many of these. You just read, every page is just filled with these evocative details. But of course, in some ways, the ones that are most evocative are also the most troubling and traumatic. For me, I think it is, one is that scene in the plaza in Amsterdam as people are gathered about to be deported to Westerbork. And just what she is seeing, so it's not just I'm here, I'm scared, she is describing what other people look like, the grandmothers who are on the benches. She describes actual children who were there with the color of their hair and what their mothers are doing. I think there's one where a mother of 4-year-old twins is using her suitcase to block the sun and to make a sleeping place for her children. And then the other, and this is probably, I think, the hardest thing to get through. But again, you're with Hannah, and for some bizarre reason, that's a little comforting, is when the children in Westerbork are about to be deported. Hannah and her sister are in an orphanage because their mother is dead. So even though their father and their grandparents are also with them in Westerbork, they can't be living with them. They're in this orphanage. And at some point, after being protected for a while, the Germans decide they're going to just clear out the orphanage. And you describe, or Hannah describes, not just, what happens the night before when the rabbi gathers all the children around. And it's like seeing so many of us seen in synagogues, right? Where the rabbi calls up the children and has a special blessing. How was that? I imagine for Hannah, and I think she does say this, that was one of the most difficult times. Were all of those details at her disposal, or did you have to extract them from her?
That particular night was very much indelible in her mind, and she described it in quite specific detail. She also spoke about this little girl, Sarah Ava, who she was very close with. And so she kind of fixated on this little girl who became like her, charge at the orphanage. But that night, especially the scene of the rabbi taking all the children, as you say, under his talus and giving the blessing, the special blessing for protection that usually give for I think it's called the blessing of the Kohanim, was something that was just sort of seared into her memory. And also for her, she remembers so vividly returning back to the orphanage and it just being completely empty. And that was just devastating to her.
Did she get, emotional, or had she told this story so many times by the point you encountered her that this was kind of, she might be able to handle it better than you could?
Yeah. I would say she didn't get visibly emotional in terms of like choking up and crying. But she would say like, okay, we have to pause now. I'm just really too tired to go on. But inevitably she would say that and have another cup of tea and another slice of chocolate. She was quite into chocolate, another like piece of chocolate. And she would almost always she would say that and then would go on for like another hour or so. But sometimes not. Sometimes it was too much. And she would say, I have to go take a nap. And I would say, I have to take a nap too, because it was too hard. It was too hard. I would often just feel like completely depleted after speaking to her. And then at one point she said, my dreams are back. My bad dreams are back. She's having bad dreams related to the war again. And that was when I started having bad dreams about the war as well. And I have to say, now with the book out and like doing interviews and talking, I started having bad dreams again, because I just, I think you'll appreciate this as a journalist. And as a journalist, you try to keep some distance, right? Because you're telling the story of somebody else. And apropos that Achberg Fellowship I did on journalism and trauma at Columbia University, one of the most important things they told us was like, imagine you're wearing a rain jacket. So the stories that you're being told, the traumatic incident that you're reporting on, the bombing or the fire, it like hits your rain jacket, but doesn't like penetrate your skin. Because you need to protect yourself when you're like a first responder when you're reporting on, breaking news and terrible things, and you need to protect yourself. And in this case, I think I kind of left the raincoat off, I kind of let it sort of permeate more. I was also trying to sort of be a vessel for Hannah's story. And especially after she died, like literally like sitting at my desk and trying to sort of imagine like, how would Hannah say this? How would Hannah sort of, this is the information she gave me, how would she shape it in some way? And I was always trying to talk to her about scene. She was like very versed in it by the end. She's like, okay, you want another scene? I understand. You want another scene. Not just this happened and then that happened and this happened and that happened, but like, can you talk to me in scene? So she was learning and I was learning, and I'd never done this before. I did reporting before, but never written a book before. So together we were kind of finding our way in the dark. But it was emotionally hard for both of us. And for her daughter, Ruti. Her daughter, Ruti, was there, next to us. She was helping out, fill in information. She knows her mother's story almost as well as her mother does. She was also helpful, also, of course, after she died, and filling in information and looking at things and fact checking.
Speaking of fact checking, one of the sensitivities about any kind of oral history, and I think this is, particularly true with oral histories from the Holocaust, is these events happened a long time ago. These are individualized memories. They may not always be accurate, right? Mm-hmm. They're the person's felt memories, but if you compare them to the historical record, they don't always necessarily line up. And I was wondering, and I think that's particularly a sensitive issue with Holocaust survivors. And I was wondering how, how you handled that. I mean, how you handled Hannah telling her story, but then, as I know you did, looking to see how it comported with the historical record.
Yeah, I mean, I think sort of like cross-referencing with other accounts and also talking to historians and saying, is this correct? Is that, did this happen this when? The historians at the Anne Frank House were really wonderful and helpful to me. I got to meet them when I was on a trip to Amsterdam exactly this time last year, kind of in the footsteps of Hannah trip that I did. So historians from there and historians in Israel and historians in Europe, they were also helpful to me. But this is also, I think, understand that memoir is also impressionistic. It's not an autobiography. It's not a biography. So there, someone's memories will be different from someone else's memories. And again, like the example of those little children you mentioned at the day of deportation and their mother. I mean, that was from an interview that I saw these twins, now adults, giving in their testimony, and so they were there at the same time, and they were Anna's neighbors, and she knew them. So there was also, again, this sort of like pastiche of pieces, putting the pieces together from the same day of events.
Okay, that's good to know. One other thing that struck me was that, and I think some people particularly want to have heroes, to have good people, to have people who you can look at and say, they are acting admirably, and maybe even that's how I would act in that kind of situation. And one of the things, there are obviously some in Hannah's account. There's Mrs. Abrahams in Bergen-Belsen, who sort of invites Hannah and her sister into her family and helps her to survive those incredibly terrible conditions. There, I'm now going to say it. So you say it, her neighbor in.
Mrs. Houtsmith, Maya Houtsmith. Mm-hmm.
Okay. And then, but most of them, they tend to be, and they're the burn bombs. The burn bombs are an amazing story too in Westerbork, but there aren't many. And then when you look to non-Jews, there are probably even fewer, right? There's one Nazi doctor who does maybe a kind thing without much consequence. There's a German regular soldier who gives Gabi a cookie. And that's kind of it. So I was wondering, and I think this is particularly interesting in light of the fact that one of the most famous lines from Anna Frank's diary is the one, because in spite of everything, she still maintained her ideals, because in spite of everything, I still believe that people are really good at heart. And then you have Hannah sort of saying, I'm not sure she would have continued to think that after Auschwitz, but I was wondering what Hannah's view of this was. I mean, of, how you go on, whether you do in fact think of people as good as at heart after the experiences that she went through. How did she come out of it?
Right. So just a quick note of so Mrs. Houtzman, the neighbor, actually was Jewish, and she had a Jewish husband, but she herself was not Jewish. So that's an example of a neighbor who really, rose to the occasion. And it turns out I interviewed her son, Georgie. Well, I know it was Georgie. He was actually George now in his 80s and living in Scotland. And he told me that his mother hid Jews in the basement of the building during Roundup. So she was really quite extraordinary. So there were helpers for sure. And I think a lot of the people that helped her during the war and also after the war were people that her father had helped. So there's a really nice story, I think, of people helping, of sort of passing it on. Her father and her grandfather were known as sort of especially helpful figures in the Jewish community, both in Germany and in Holland. And so there were a lot of people who came forward and sort of looked out for Hannah because of that. I think there's an amazing story of female solidarity that runs through the book throughout, but especially in the barracks. When you see on the terrible nights when Hannah ventures out after she hears Anna is actually in Bergen-Belsen, which is sort of like the emotional high point of the story. And she all this time, has been thinking that Anna is safe in Switzerland. Mind you, when the family disappears one July morning in 1942, they're the first family to vanish. Okay. From that point on, when Hannah goes to school almost every day, and when she goes back in the fall, there's a different pupil or teacher or administrator that's just missing. And they don't know if that person has been deported or if they've gone into hiding. But Anna was the first to vanish. And the cover story the family had sort of left behind, as it were, was that they had gone to Switzerland. So while everybody else was sort of vanished to God knows where, she was sort of grateful to know that Anna was safe in Switzerland. And she had this idea that, in her head, that she was with her grandmother and her cousins, and she was having hot chocolate and ice skating. That gave her great comfort. So she was horrified to find out that no, in fact, Anna was in Bergen-Belsen. And the reason I bring up the story about help is that, that night she goes out and has this, you'll read in the book if you haven't read already, this encounter that she has with this broken, shattered, starving, and sick Anna. And Anna begs her for food, and Hannah, who doesn't know how she's going to bring her food, immediately answers, "Yes, I will bring you some." Goes back to the barracks. The women who have been so concerned about her going out, they cobble together the little that they do have, and send it back to her as like a food package. And they end up doing this more than once, and they didn't know Anna, but they were so moved by this friendship and this act of friendship that Hannah wanted to help her, that they came together. So there was and also the story of Hannah helping Gabi, and Gabi helping her little sister Gabi. I mean, Gabi was very tiny. She was only 2.5 years old when the family was deported. And so I think a lot of the stories of the Holocaust were maybe not outsiders helping so much, but often the family unit, two sisters or a mother and a daughter or two brothers, or in the case of also the Abraham family, the sort of non-blood family kind of coming together and uniting and bonding and helping one another. I'm still going to answer your question. I think she often talked about how she did feel that the Anne Frank story was more than a bit whitewashed, and this sort of focus on the humanity and the good, completely ignoring passages in the diary that are quite dark and talk about the thunder closing in on them. I mean, for every passage of positive, you also have a passage where Anna was very aware of how sinister the world was and how dark it had become. She was not some Pollyanna, we might see her now in fireworks at Disney World, but that was not the world she was living in, and she was aware of it. So, the fact that people so much associate the story of the Dutch Jews as a story of Anne Frank is completely wrong. Even Hannah herself, until fairly recent years, kind of bought the story that there must have been a lot of people helping, but there weren't a lot of people helping. 75% of Jews living in Holland were murdered. 75%. It's the highest amount in Western Europe. Yeah. And it's only second to the story of Jewry in Poland and in Greece. So it was devastating. I'm just going to plug in my computer because I see it's about to die. 1 second, hold on.
We don't want your computer dying.
No, sorry. So that's better. So, for me, that image really comes home. There's a photograph of Anna's 10th birthday party, and they're outside of their home in the beautiful square outside of their houses, about 8 or 9 little girls in a row in their party dresses and their hair bows and their black Mary Jane shoes. And in that picture, you see on one, in the middle of that, there's 4 girls in a row in the midst of those 9 or 10 girls. Anna, their good friend Zana Letterman, and another girl named Julitli, like Julie. It's like the Dutch form of Julie. Sorry for not getting her name right, Julitli. And there are 4 Jewish girls, and out of the 4, only 1 survives, which is Hannah, which is a complete representation of the, 75% of Jewry that was raped out in Holland.
And there is a friend, I think she's in that picture, but I may be wrong, whose family were Nazis.
Exactly. There's Lucy Van Dyke, whose parents were Nazis. Yes. And she was in a youth group. And Hannah remembers her seeing her once in the street and, her kind of avoiding one another. And that's an example. I described sort of Lucy, what she wore, like she was wearing. So that's an example of like going in and saying, hey, what did they wear? What was the youth movement uniform? So I would go and I would find what it looked like and then describe in the book what, her black cape and the, and the black and the red and what it looked like. That was, that was part of, that was so disturbing is you had these friends that were your birthday parties and, your classmates. And not only some of them were, at a certain point, the anti-Jewish laws prohibited you from even visiting your non-Jewish friends. Some of your Jewish friends like really became the enemy.
Right. One other thing that was interesting, I mean, there's so much, but, Hannah is an observant Jew. And is throughout her experience, right? I mean, so, she says prayers, right, at certain points. She at least thinks about the need to keep kosher, although she ultimately decides it's more important to preserve life than it is to maintain those laws. But I was wondering about her, I think especially it's the prayers, right? So all these horrible things are happening. And then she says prayers about a few things, right? And I can't even remember exactly what it is, but it's not, how did she maintain that? I mean, to even think in Bergen-Belsen that there's a God and a God who is worth appealing to.
Mm-hmm. She was always very deeply moved by her father's spirituality, and I think that became her guide. Her father grew up secular in Germany, Christmas trees on Christmas. It was during World War I. He encountered Hasidic Jews in Lithuania when he was based there, and he became enamored with the Jewish community there and the family and the Yiddishkeit, and he goes back and becomes both a Zionist and an observant Jew, 2 things that were kind of off trend at that moment for German Jews.
And certainly not true of the Frank family.
And not through the Frank family, not. Although Anna's mother was from a observant family, I guess you maybe call them sort of like conservative in our time, sort of traditional. Otto Frank was completely not religious. And so, she described to me, like she remembered, all the other fathers at synagogue would be like kibitzing in the back of the synagogue, talking about, business or that. Her father was wrapped in his prayer shawl, swaying and very much in prayer. And even in Bergen-Belsen, he gave study lessons about the Talmud and the Torah, he's a really remarkable guy. He was also a high-ranking official in the Weimar government as an observant Jew, and like had Talmud classes once a week in his office, which is, he was very extraordinary in a lot of ways. But and there were the religious Jews in Bergen-Belsen, and they did, like her father, they would give classes in a way to sort of give strength and give hope and kind of give a sense for the young people to have identity and connection and pride in their Judaism. And for her, though, I think religion was really an anchor. I think she really held steadfast to it. There are people, of course, that didn't want nothing to do, were angry with God during and after the Holocaust. For her, she didn't question too much, but she did very much embrace it, and it was really it was a bit of a lifesaver, I think, a way, and kind of kept her stable after the war as well. It gave her a connection to her past, and the rituals kind of brought her in some ways back to life.
So one thing, and this is, I think, maybe one of the harder questions, which is in reading the book, you get, I got a sense that while Hannah survives, because she's young, she's healthy, she's lucky, that's always the most important factor. But there's also a sense that there's something about her attitude, her approach to these conditions that helped her to hold it together, and some of it is just her fanaticism about keeping clean, right? I have to be healthy. I can't get sick. It's really important to do this washing, even when I don't want to. She's always strategizing a little bit. I know just when they're being transported in the boxcar from Westerbork to Bergen-Belsen, she decides, I'm going to find a place for herself and Gabi near the door so that maybe we can get some fresh air. She then calculates that might not have been totally wise because it's freezing, but you always get this sense of her on the lookout for ways in which she could survive. And on one hand, I like that. I like that insight. On the other hand, it made me uncomfortable. I don't like thinking about people surviving because of their own volition, because it does seem to suggest that people who didn't survive didn't have that same attitude, approach. And if they just did, things might have turned out differently. So I don't know if you felt that at all, if Hannah felt that at all, or you just thought this was Hannah's story and, this is what she did. And she did survive.
Yeah, I didn't look at it that way so much. I just looked at her as a story of self-preservation, and that she was smart about doing it without sort of knowing the psychology behind things. She just sort of automatically did what was right for her. She always talks about the fact that she didn't have the quote unquote luxury of, rolling the other way and dying. You wanted to die at a certain point. It was so awful. She describes the German word for it called Musselmen, I think, people who kind of became catatonic because they were so hungry and so diseased. But she had to keep it together because at this point
her sister. That's it.
Yeah, she was she was orphaned gradually, right? First of all, she took on great responsibility before the war, before even deportation begins, because a few months before deportation, her beloved mother, who was extremely practical, and I think she must have taken a lot of lessons from, extremely practical, died in childbirth. And her father was distraught and overwhelmed. And he was basically like, here's your little sister. You take care of her. And so she became sort of a little
14, mother. Right?
Yeah, she's 14 years old. And there's a photograph, I don't know if we'll see it soon or at some point, of Hannah and Gabi in the sandbox with Georgie, the neighbor, the son of Mrs. Houtsmith. And you see, she sort of, the way she's holding herself, she doesn't look like a 14-year-old girl. She looks older to me. She looks like someone who's really together. She's already like kind of a little mama already. And then I was really struck when we talked when I interviewed her about her father and her father's death in Bergen-Belsen. He was in the barracks and he died in this really especially tragic, awful moment because they were about to, they thought, be exchanged. They were what were called exchange Jews. They were going to be exchanged as prisoners of war for British soldiers. And they were on the brink of that. And he dies right as that's happening. And she doesn't want to, she knows that, at this point, the corpses are being piled up high in Bergen-Belsen. And she does not want to see, God forbid, him, she's described to me, talk about the vivid details. She didn't want to see a leg sticking out of a wheelbarrow that could belong to her father. She didn't want that. So she averted her eyes. Mm-hmm. When she started seeing the stacks of bodies, she averted her eyes. It's really an act of self-preservation. And I think that helped her, I imagine, sort of to carry on later. She didn't have as much of, she had terrible images in her mind still, but maybe she had less than somebody else, because she did what she had to do to sort of stay focused.
So we're getting to that point. So I'm going to ask one, sadly, this went by very fast, but I had one last question, which is that, and you write about this, but I think what I'd like is your insight on why this was the case, which is Hannah starts speaking about her experiences almost immediately. And that's very unusual in post-war Israel, because she does, in fact, fulfill her father's Zionist dream and moves to Israel. And at that point, it's really not, and you do talk about this until the Eichmann trial in 1961, that the state is more willing to acknowledge the Holocaust and what happened to so many of its citizens. And there was some of that in the United States as well. What I was wondering is what you think it was about Hannah that enabled her to be willing to have those conversations when so many of her fellow survivors were not.
Yeah, she felt this incredible sense of, in Hebrew you call it shlichut, which is not a great, translation, except for like sort of she really felt this need to be an emissary of this story. She was anointed very young, 1957. Anne Frank's diary has been published. The play has come out, which brings it to a whole other level of attention. Otto Frank asks her to go on a speaking tour of 18 cities to America.
Little babies at home.
Little babies at home. It was not, to be taken for granted. She would say yes to this mission. Her husband goes with her. She's kind of a shy person. She'd been this like retiring, she was basically at this point, she was a nurse for her career, but at this point she had taken time out to raise her children. She was like a housewife. Suddenly, there were journalists from all over the world coming to interview her after the Anne Frank play came out. It sort of came out that she was connected to Anne Frank. And she sits and has coffee. She's invited to the president's house to have coffee with the first lady, Rachel Yanait, who was an impressive educator, early Zionist in her own right, who sends her off with warm wishes and imparts in her that yes, she has a mission to share the story. It's a remarkable letter. It was written in 1957 on the eve of this trip, and Rachel Yanait writes to her, "You, Hannah, are going to tell the world the story of how our people were slaughtered. There was no word for Holocaust yet." She's like, and she said, "Our young people in this country don't even know the story." This is 11 years, afterwards, 11 years, that's it. And so, again, she's sort of anointed by Otto Frank. She's anointed by, the First Lady of Israel, and she takes it seriously. And I think she, until the end of her days, and she was so lucid and so smart and so with it until the very, very end. I want to make that very, very clear. Like, she was so intelligent and so sharp and didn't miss a beat and had this dry sense of humor. But she always said, like, why did they do this to us? Like, it was unfathomable to her. And it was very important for her to people to know that Jews were killed just because they were Jews. Mm-hmm. And she wanted the people to know that. And she understood that, yes, she had Anne Frank's being connected to Anne Frank gave her survivorship extra clout. Mm-hmm. And she understood that, and she used it in a very wise way.
And then just as the last thing, and then I'm going to turn it over to Suzanne, I don't think we can ignore the parallels here, right? So in the same way that Hannah survived and told Anna's story, you are telling Hannah's story. And I do think that the way you told it and your determination to tell it in the most evocative way possible and pulling out all of those details means that it goes beyond even the substantial audience that Hannah had gained. So for that, we are all grateful to you, Dina, for doing this. So thanks very much. Okay, Suzanne, I guess we're going to see if we have some questions from the audience.
Yes. First of all, both of you, thank you so much. We could go on and on and on. One thing I want to do really quickly, because I didn't want to interrupt during the conversation, is there are some pictures. I know people are going to tell me that I'm going to go through them too quickly and that I'm not going to show all of them, but they are in the book. And so people can see them. So let me share my screen and we can take a look at just a few of them. I will also say, while I didn't read the book, I listened to the audio version of it, and it is just very, very powerful to be able to hear the words as well. So I encourage people who like to listen to books that they should do that as well. Okay. Do you want to real quickly, we'll try and just go through just a couple of these.
Yeah, this is Hannah, as you see, age 3 with her father, Hans Goslar. They're in the Tiergarten, which is a big, beautiful park just across the road from the apartment building they lived in central Berlin, right near the Reichstag. They had to live close to the Reichstag, the seat of power in Germany, because her father had to walk to work on Shabbat sometimes. They had to live in walking distance, and that was her beloved park. And that was, that's Yeah. And this is her mother, Ruth Goslar. Her mother, who loved German culture, so much, she named Hannah was Hannah Lise. Hannah Lise is for short for Elizabeth, which was the name of Goethe's mother. So like many Germans of her day, she was a devotee of Goethe. And for her, like Anna Frank's mother as well, and the other girls' mothers, it was really hard adjusting to Holland. They missed their lives in Germany very much. This is a picture I was mentioning earlier. This is Hannah at 14 with Gabby, 2.5, just very shortly before they were deported. And the little blonde boy to Hannah's right is Georgie, the son of Mrs. Housemith, the very righteous neighbor. And then on her lap is her little sister, Gabi. She was known as Gabi then. She now goes by Raleigh, sort of short for Rachel, which is her middle name. And I just want to let you know that she is alive and well and 84 years old, a retired teacher, still volunteering, working, like Hannah, has many children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Oh, okay.
Sorry. That one.
No, okay. That's the picture. So this is the two girls outside. They lived in side-by-side apartments, buildings side by side in a beautiful neighborhood called, I'm going to mispronounce it, the Dutch, but it's like Riverbert. It's a leafy sort of family-friendly neighborhood in southern Amsterdam, or think of sort of like Brooklyn is to Manhattan or Brookline is to Boston, a little away from the hustle and bustle. It was a brand new neighborhood at the time, so it had a lot of empty flats. And so the German Jews who were fleeing in 33, of which the Frank and Goslar families were among the first to come to Amsterdam as German Jewish refugees, they were able to find housing there. And it became something of an enclave of German Jewish refugees. This is the day, June 20th, exactly a week ago, in 1943. This was the day that Hannah and her family were deported. This was one of the final roundups of Amsterdam, and one of the biggest. It was all the remaining Jews that were still in Amsterdam, pretty much. And as you see, it was a warm, beautiful day, not a cloud in the sky, but people they were going east. They didn't know for how long. They were wearing their winter coats because they knew that they might need them. They were told very specific things to bring, like bedrolls and backpacks. But I just want to make it very clear, they did not know what going out east meant yet. There were different rumors and whatnot circulating around, but most of them, did not expect they were going to death camps, of course.
And who took a picture like this?
So this was a Dutch Nazi who took these photographs. There's an extraordinary collection of these photographs from that very day. And that actually, Laurel, to your question, I got some of the details of what it actually looked like by literally looking at close-up photograph after photograph. Right. I had initially inquired to get the entire collection of these photos, which are actually available online from Holland, because I thought maybe I would find Hannah's family in them. I didn't, but it really was helpful to sort of see like what were they packing and the bottles of milk and the sandwiches. And also what crazy to me, I have to say, sorry, one thing, and reading some accounts, people talked about how they wore like silk dresses. They thought if they looked better, maybe they'd be treated better by the Nazis. Mm. This is the transit camp of Westerbork. This is where almost all the Dutch Jews were sent on the border of Germany and Holland before they were sent out east, usually to Sobibor and Auschwitz, never to return, or if they were lucky, to the concentration camps that were slightly better conditions, Bergen-Belsen and Theresienstadt.
Whoops. This one.
Oh yeah, and this is a beautiful picture. I love it. It's after the war. Hannah, who can imagine, she was only 30 kilos after the war. I'm always forgetting what that is in pounds. I don't know if anyone can do the quick conversion, maybe about 70 pounds or so. But this is about 2 years after convalescing and getting better. And she's with her aunt in Switzerland and her little sister Gabby, and I just love how they're looking at each other there.
And then this last one.
This was a photo taken as part of an amazing project started by some friends of mine in Jerusalem called the Lanka Project, which sought to take portraits of Holocaust survivors around the world. And Hannah was one of them. And in this picture, the photographer, Eric Sultan, took Hannah in her beautiful red shirt, holding a picture of Anna. from school. And by the way, Hannah, this photo, this sort of a famous iconic photo of Anna, right? But there's a similar picture that Hannah has sitting at a similar desk. They're, and there's many pictures like that of their friends as well. It was like their school photos.
Great, thank you. And as I said, all of the pictures are, and more actually, are in the book. Let's see if we can get to some of these questions. How did you connect with Hannah to begin with? And what, because she was sharing her story from the beginning, what took so long for her to want to write a book?
Yeah, good question. I'd first met her in 1998 when I was assigned by the Associated Press to interview her because there was actually a book that had just come out about her. It's important to know there's a book by a woman named Allison Leslie Gold, a wonderful book for school children for about the 10, 11, 12-year-old age bracket. And it's a biography of Hannah. That book led many years later to a Dutch production company making a film called My Best Friend Anne Frank. That film was picked up by Netflix, and that film on Netflix got a lot of publicity, including different interviews with Hannah. One of them was in the Times of London. One of my editors who became one of my editors at Penguin Random House in London saw that article, decided to see if Hannah had ever written a memoir, and tracked her down and found out that no, she had never written a memoir before, but she had that book that had come out for a young audience that had come out, and she also had been telling her story around the world. So I think it hadn't really occurred to her. I think she thought she had it covered between that book and between telling her story.
Did Hannah ever suffer from survivor's guilt, and how did she handle that if she did?
It's a really good question, and I asked her that several times. No, not really. I think it goes in part back to her faith in God. And her faith in general. She didn't really question it. She said, I was allowed to live, and it's no judgment that others were not, obviously, but she felt that she had to survive for her sister. It was not even a question. So she was lucky, I think, to be spared of survivor's guilt.
Mm-hmm. How does her family feel about all of this new publicity?
I think they are overjoyed. And I think we talk about, I think we're all overwhelmed and surprised by it as well. They were very much part of this project. It would not have happened without them. They came together as a group to decide to do the project, and that, that her daughter Ruth would be, hand in hand with her going forward in it. And I was just in London with Ruth, with Ruti, we call her Ruti, in London promoting the book. So they are all about continuing Hannah's story. Hannah would, travel abroad, especially in her retirement. She was in Japan, she was in South Africa, she was in Europe, she was in America. And every time she would take a different grandchild with her. And so it sort of became like a family business, but it was something it's very much part of them. They all grew up feeling that Anne Frank was part of their household. In fact, her husband used to say that he would joke that Anne Frank was like his second wife.
Was there one or two things that you learned that surprised you, that you did not know with regard to the Holocaust?
Interesting. I think the dehumanization is something that I knew in sort of broad strokes, but when I had to go into the nitty gritty of what dehumanization looked like, what typhus does to someone's body, what hunger does to somebody, what it means when you're measuring out bread in like centimeters, cubic, 3 centimeters for you, 3 centimeters for you. When you're eating like a thin gruel, when you're not even allowed to use sanitary pads, when there's no when everyone's going to the bathroom in these horrible conditions, that sort of level of just complete debasement. Although again, I knew it sort of theoretically, but when I had to sort of like walk through the story in Hannah's shoes, that was jarring for me. I think also, again, I didn't know that 75% of Jews in Holland were murdered. And for me, I feel like I got to know Hannah and her family. I feel like I got to know her parents and her grandparents. Hannah was a little bit of like a Where's Waldo character in Jewish history. Her grandfather had been close with Theodor Herzl, the founder of Zionism. When she was 3 years old, she sat on the lap of Albert Einstein. She, of course, happens to move in next door to Anne Frank, who becomes the most famous face of the Holocaust. Later on, a cousin is one of the people who captures Eichmann in Argentina. I mean, so there was a lot I was learning all the time. But again, I think the sort of the level of debasement, but also the level of humanity. I didn't understand also, like the level of people that came together and created these sort of voluntary bonds and family really surprised me in a good way.
Mm-hmm. I think also I mentioned to you that my reading of it, you think of so long ago, people lived so differently, and the way that she tells the story and just talking about the everyday life, I could relate seeing my kids with planning birthday parties and going from one activity, going with your mom somewhere. I mean, it's so relatable in a way that I feel like I personally had not experienced when reading about and learning about the Holocaust. And you were really able to do that with Hannah and sharing her story. What's the significance of this book today at a time when the rise of anti-Semitism is continuing to go up, and yet at the same time your book is on the New York Times bestseller list? What's the significance of having a book like this for people to read?
I mean, for me, I am so grateful that this book has fallen upon such incredible attention. I think people sort of think they know the story of the Holocaust because they've heard 6 million Jews and Auschwitz, and they have certain ideas. But this book takes you into the experience of one person sort of in real time, and you're living history forward, not backwards, right? You're living forward, and the growing horror of what's going on is occurring to Hannah gradually. As she understands things, you understand things. And I feel like, the story of the Diary of Anne Frank is incredibly important. But we are with her. Imagine we're sort of like zoomed up close in, like imagine like in a film, you were close up, you're inside Anna's head, right? You were inside her thoughts and her emotions. And she's hearing things from the outside world, but she's not experiencing them. In some ways, this book is sort of the next, I don't know, the sequel is exactly the right word, but it sort of takes you beyond that. I think it's remarkable. Anna is actually writing about Hannah in the diary and imagining what she's going through. At the same time, I think one of the times she's writing about imagining poor Hannah, and poor Hannah's out there and in danger. I am safe. It's almost the same night, or it's the same week that Hannah loses all those beautiful orphans from the orphanage. So it's interesting symbiosis between the two of them. But what Hannah can do is tell you what Anna did not live to tell. It's the story that Anna did not get to write, of what it was like in Bergen-Belsen, and what it was like, losing all these people and the degradation and all the horrors that she saw. So I'm very grateful that I'm getting letters from Texas and Louisiana and Kentucky, and people are saying they're so moved, and they're learning so much. And I think it's very urgent. And you mentioned the rise of anti-Semitism. I mean, just this week in Europe, far right-wing parties won seats in Germany, a council in Germany, and also in parliament in Greece. We're seeing this surge of the far right, and even neo-Nazi groups that were once completely, persona non grata, getting attention and getting votes. So I feel like the story is ever more urgent because of that, and because people clearly have forgotten, that there was a systematic slaughter of millions of people, and we can never really know enough about that.
And as we wrap up, somebody asked a great question. What did you learn about yourself throughout the process?
Wow. I haven't learned about myself. I mean, I've always known that I'm a bit of an empath, right? That I'm empathetic and I can sort of, connect with people on a deep level. But I think I learned that I can really, really walk in someone else's shoes and really help impart their story on a level that's not at a remove like I normally am as a journalist, but to really be physically and emotionally present on a different level, and to completely buckle down and really do nothing else and be obsessed by nothing else. I mean, I didn't go out on weekends and nights. My friends had to forgive me. My kids were a little like, oh my God. When I told Mia once, like, maybe I'll write another book one day. She's like, not while I'm living in the house. Like, you're crazy when you're writing a book. But to know that I can get into that level of sort of concentration and focus. And I really felt like nothing else interested me. I was only reading books about the Holocaust. I was only, or things that related to the story of the Dutch, the Dutch history. So I guess I learned about myself that I can go deep and go and sit there with it.
Thank both you and Laurel for joining us today. I want to thank our audience for joining us. I will be sending out a follow-up email that will contain a link to this recording, so please share with others. Again, the book is called My Friend Anne Frank, and I put a a link in the chat where you can purchase it. Also today there was an article in the New York Times about it, so congratulations on that. I want to remind everybody to go to momentmag.com where you can sign up for next week's program about writing about Jewish lives in the 21st century with author Allegra Goodman, and that will be on July 11th. Again, thank you for joining us, and we'll see everybody next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you.